The altar had not been opened in 11 years, and it did not want to be opened now. Behind it, bolted into the wall with iron brackets gone the color of dried blood, sat a cabinet the size of a coffin standing on its end. Someone had sealed it with 3 padlocks, each a different make, each rusted to a different shade of orange, as if they'd been added one at a time across different decades by hands that no longer trusted the ones before them. A strip of yellowed masking tape ran across the middle seam. On it, in handwriting gone soft and grey with age, someone had written a single word, then later tried to scratch it out. Josie Calloway didn't know what the word said yet. She only knew that whatever was sealed behind that altar had been important enough to lock 3 times, and forgotten enough that nobody had come back to check on it in over a decade. She was 20 years old. She had $38 folded into her left sock, a duffel bag with 2 changes of clothes, and a key, an actual, physical, rust-spotted key, to a chapel the county called unfit for occupancy, and that she, 4 days ago, had called home for the first time in her life. 6 days earlier, she'd been sleeping in her car outside a Waffle House in rural Tennessee, aged out of the foster system at 18 with nowhere to land, bouncing between a cousin's couch and whatever shift work she could talk her way into. Then a lawyer's letter had found her, forwarded twice, wrinkled, almost thrown away unopened, informing her that a man named Earl Prather, her mother's great-uncle, a man she had met exactly once at a funeral when she was 9, had left her his property in his will. The letter called it a modest structure and surrounding land. The county called it a liability. Josie had paid $9 in back taxes to formally take possession, because $9 was all that stood between her and a piece of land with her name on it, and $9 was something she could actually afford. Do you know what it's like to hold a key to something you've never seen, and feel more hope from it than you've felt in years? That's exactly where Josie was standing when she first saw the chapel. A squat, white clapboard building with a bell tower leaning 2 degrees off true, windows boarded from the inside, and a front door that groaned like it hadn't been asked to open since the Clinton administration. Kudzu had crawled halfway up the north wall like it was trying to pull the building back into the ground. She stood there a long moment with her hand on the door, feeling the wind cut cold across the back of her neck, smelling wet pine and old dust even from outside, thinking plainly, I have nowhere else to go, so this has to be enough. It wasn't just a chapel. What nobody at the courthouse had bothered to mention, maybe because none of them had set foot inside in years, was that Earl Prather had spent the last 2 decades of his life alone in that building and had left behind more than dust and pews. If you've ever stood in front of a locked door that used to belong to someone you barely knew and felt like it might be about to tell you who they really were, you already understand the feeling that stopped Josie cold in that doorway. I'm glad you're here for this one, by the way. If you're new to these Sunday night stories, welcome, settle in, because this is a long one, and it's worth staying for every minute of it. Inside, the air was still and cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. The particular stillness of a room sealed away from time. Dust hung so thick in the shafts of grey light through the cracked boards that it looked almost solid, like she could press her palm into it. 11 rows of pews sat exactly as they'd been left, a hymnal open on the 3rd row like someone had set it down mid-song and never come back. And at the front, past a rotted red carpet runner and a pulpit gone soft with water damage, stood the altar, and behind it, that cabinet, with its 3 mismatched locks and its half-erased word. She didn't touch it that first day. She told herself it was because she didn't have the tools, and that was true enough. But if she was honest, and Josie Calloway was, at her core, a brutally honest person, mostly because she'd never had the luxury of pretending things were better than they were, she didn't touch it because some part of her was afraid of what she'd find, or worse, afraid of what she wouldn't. What she didn't let herself think about, not yet, was the small brass plate screwed into the cabinet's door, half hidden under grime, with 3 engraved letters that didn't match Earl Prather's name at all. She'd deal with that later. Right now, she needed somewhere to sleep that wasn't her car, and this, dust, locks and all, was hers. The lock on that cabinet would stay closed for 6 more days. What came out of it would change everything she thought she knew about the man who'd left it to her. 3 weeks before any of that, Josie Calloway had been folding towels at a laundromat in Chattanooga for $4 under the table, counting the hours until closing so she could move her car to a different parking lot before anyone noticed her sleeping in it twice in the same spot. She'd aged out of foster care at 18 with a trash bag of belongings and a caseworker's business card she never called. 2 years of what people politely termed instability had followed. A stretch on a friend's couch that ended in a fight neither of them fully remembered starting. A warehouse job that dried up when the company relocated. 6 months in a studio apartment she lost the second her hours got cut. She'd learned, the hard way, twice over, that the world did not owe her softness, and she'd stopped expecting any. She was guarded in the particular way of someone who'd loved people who left. A mother who died when Josie was 7, a father never in the picture, a string of foster placements ranging from indifferent to actively unkind. With one bright exception, she tried not to think about too often. She'd learned to need nothing from anyone, to keep her stitched-together life private, to never hope out loud. Which was why, when the letter arrived, she almost threw it away. It had been forwarded twice, first to an old address, then to her cousin Denise's place, where it sat on a kitchen counter for the better part of a week before Denise remembered to mention it. Some lawyer thing, probably a scam, Denise had said. Josie almost believed her. But something about the return address, a small firm 2 counties over from where her mother had grown up, made her open it anyway. Earl Prather. The name meant almost nothing to her. A blurry memory of a tall, quiet man at her mother's funeral, 13 years ago, standing at the back of the room, not speaking to anyone, leaving before the reception. She remembered her grandmother mentioning him once, only once, with a strange tightness in her voice. My father's brother, we don't really talk about him, and never bringing him up again. He had died alone, no children, no spouse, and somehow, out of everyone he could have left his chapel and the 10 acres around it to, he had left it to a great niece he'd met exactly once. The lawyer on the phone hadn't been much help. Property's been vacant for over a decade, he'd said. County's had a lien on it for back taxes. It's yours if you want to clear that up, but I should tell you, it's probably not worth much. Structure's likely condemned. $9, he told her, would settle the lien. $9, and it was hers. She had $38 to her name at the time. She drove 4 hours the next morning. Now, standing in the nave of a church that smelled of dust and rot, and something faintly, strangely like beeswax, Josie Calloway understood that she had traded $9 for a roof, and judging by the cabinet at the front of the room, quite possibly for a great deal more than that. She just didn't yet know if that was a good trade or the worst one she'd ever made. The first night, Josie slept in the 3rd pew from the back, wrapped in a moving blanket she'd bought for $6 at a gas station, with her duffel bag as a pillow and a flashlight propped against the hymnal rack so she wouldn't wake up in total darkness. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself a lot of things that first night, most of them to keep from thinking about the cabinet at the front of the room, its 3 padlocks catching the flashlight beam every time she rolled over. By morning, cold grey light was coming through a crack in the boarded windows, cutting a thin blade across the floor, and Josie had made a decision. If this place was going to be hers, if it was the only thing standing between her and the front seat of a Honda with 190,000 miles on it, she was going to make it livable before she let herself think about anything sealed shut inside it. She started with the windows. Most of the boards came off easier than she expected, the nails long since rusted soft, and light flooded into the nave in a way that made the whole room look different, less like a tomb, more like a house that had simply been asleep a long time. Dust motes swam in the sudden sun. She found a broom in a closet behind the pulpit, its bristles worn to a stub, and swept for 2 hours until her shoulders ached, and the red carpet runner, faded but intact, showed itself to actually be red again instead of the color of dried mud. It was around noon when she heard the truck. She hadn't met a single soul since arriving. The property sat a half-mile down a gravel spur off the county road, mostly hidden by pines, the kind of place people only found if they already knew it was there. So when she heard tires crunching gravel outside, she froze mid-sweep, broom in hand, heart going fast in a way she didn't love admitting to. The man who climbed out of the truck was maybe 60, built like someone who'd done manual work his whole life and had the stoop to prove it, wearing a canvas jacket the color of a fence post. He didn't come to the door. He stood by his truck, looking at the chapel like it had personally wronged him. "You're the Prather girl," he said, when Josie stepped out onto the porch. "Not a question. Great niece," she said. "Josie?" He looked at the bell tower, still leaning its 2 degrees off true. Wondered when somebody'd finally come deal with this eyesore. Half this county figured it'd just fall down on its own eventually. He said his name was Dale Whitfield, that he ran the feed store in town, that he'd known Earl Prather about as well as anybody did, which wasn't well at all. He didn't offer to help with anything. He didn't stay long, but before he left, he said one thing that Josie turned over in her head for the rest of the day. "Man kept to himself something fierce those last years. Didn't used to be that way, I heard. Something happened to him, way before my time. Nobody round here really knows what. Something happened to him, not old age, not simple reclusiveness. Something. She didn't ask what. She didn't know Dale Whitfield well enough yet to ask, and some instinct told her the answer wouldn't come from a man who'd only known Earl Prather from a distance anyway. But she filed it away, the way she'd learned to file away every piece of information that might matter later, because in her experience, information was one of the only things nobody could take from you. By the second day, word had gotten around, the way it does in small towns, faster than any of the actual facts can travel, that the Prather girl was living out at the old chapel. Some of what came back to her, second-hand, through the one gas station in town, was not kind. Squatting in a dead man's church. Bet she's after whatever he had hidden out there. She heard it from the girl behind the register, a few years younger than her, who delivered the gossip with an apologetic wince, like she hadn't meant to repeat it, but couldn't help herself. Josie didn't have whatever he had hidden out there, not yet, not with 3 padlocks standing between her and it. But the gossip put a small, cold seed of urgency in her that she didn't examine too closely. People already thought the worst. Best not to give them anything else to talk about until she understood what she was actually sitting on. The third day brought a different kind of visitor. An older woman, small and sharp-eyed, walking rather than driving, appeared at the edge of the property around dusk, with a casserole dish covered in foil and a look that dared Josie to refuse it. She introduced herself as Ruth Ann Coulter. "Lived down the spur my whole life, knew your uncle better than anybody left breathing, though that's not saying much." She didn't ask permission to come inside. She simply walked past Josie into the nave, looked around at the swept floor and the newly unboarded windows, and gave a short nod, like Josie had passed some kind of test without knowing she was taking one. "He wouldn't let anybody in here, the last 10 years or so," Ruth Ann said, setting the casserole down on a pew. "Not even me, and I brought him supper every Sunday like clockwork." Her eyes moved to the front of the room, to the altar, to the cabinet behind it, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe, or old grief, before she looked away just as fast. "You know what's in there?" Josie asked, before she could stop herself. Ruth Ann's mouth went thin. "I know he built that cabinet himself, about 15 years back. hauled the lumber in on his own truck, wouldn't let a soul help him, not even me. And I know he added a new lock to it every few years, like he was arguing with himself about something. She picked her purse back up. Whatever's behind it, girl, he wanted it kept, and he wanted it kept private. That's about the only thing I can tell you for certain. Wanted it kept, and wanted it kept private. Not destroyed, not forgotten, kept. Josie thought about that word long after Ruth Ann's shape had disappeared back down the gravel spur into the dark. A man who added a new lock every few years wasn't a man trying to seal something away and forget it existed. He was a man circling something he couldn't quite let go of, and couldn't quite face either. That night, she ate the casserole cold, sitting on the porch steps with the last of the daylight going purple over the pines, and let herself, for the first time since arriving, really look at the building around her, at the peeling paint, the leaning tower, the 10 acres of overgrown land stretching back toward a tree line she hadn't explored yet. It was falling apart. It was also, she realized with something that surprised her by feeling almost like tenderness, the first place in 3 years that anyone had called hers without a landlord's signature attached to it. She thought about her mother, who died when Josie was 7, and who she remembered mostly in fragments. The smell of a specific dish soap, a laugh that came out sideways, hands that were always slightly too cold. She thought about the one foster placement, 3 years in, that had actually felt like something close to a home, before a policy change and a paperwork error moved her 3 counties away inside of 2 weeks. She had learned, over and over, that nothing stayed. That the softest things were always the first to be taken. But nobody could take $9 worth of back taxes and a signed deed, whatever else this place turned out to be, a liability, a money pit, a strange dead man's shrine to something he couldn't say out loud. It was, on paper, and in fact, hers. She went back inside before full dark, propped her flashlight against the hymnal rack the way she had the first night, and lay down in the 3rd pew with the moving blanket pulled up to her chin. Above her, through a gap in the roof she hadn't noticed until just then, a single star had come out clear and sharp against the darkening blue. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd start on the roof. The cabinet could wait a little longer. It had waited 11 years already. It would still be there once she'd earned the right to understand it. But as she closed her eyes, one thought kept circling back, refusing to let her fully drift off. A new lock every few years, like he was arguing with himself. Whatever Earl Prather had been arguing about, she had a feeling it wasn't finished arguing yet. The roof took longer than Josie expected, mostly because she'd never actually repaired a roof before and was teaching herself out of a library book she'd checked out 2 towns over, the librarian eyeing her with the particular curiosity of someone who already knew exactly who she was and exactly which chapel she was living in. Small towns didn't need phones to spread news. They just needed one person at a checkout counter. She spent 4 days up there, patching the worst of the gaps with tarp and scavenged shingles from a pile Dale Whitfield had. Grudgingly, wordlessly, dropped off at the end of her drive one morning without a word of explanation, driving off before she could even thank him. She found that gesture harder to figure out than anything else that week. He'd been nothing but gruff to her face, but the shingles were there, stacked and dry under a tarp, like he'd meant for her to find them and not to make a thing of it. It was on the 4th day, prying up a rotted section of roof board near the bell tower, that she found the first real seed of what would later make sense of everything. A small tin box, rusted through at one corner, wedged into the rafters, like someone had hidden it in a hurry and never come back for it. Inside, water-damaged past legibility, was what looked like it had once been a photograph. 2 figures, faces long gone to water stains, standing in front of the chapel's front doors. On the back, in the same handwriting she'd seen on the cabinet's masking tape, someone had written a date. 19 years ago, and half a name. The ink bled out before it finished. Core? She sat with that scrap of tin box on her knee for a long while, the wind moving through the pines below her, the particular hush of a rural afternoon settling over everything. Core. Could be Cora. Could be Corinne. Could be a dozen things. She tucked the tin box into her duffel bag rather than leaving it in the chapel, some instinct telling her that whatever this was, it mattered enough to keep close. That evening, restocking her water jugs at the one gas station in town, she ran into the girl behind the register again, Amber. She'd learned her name was by now 22, working the counter to save for community college 2 towns further out. Amber had a habit of talking fast when she was nervous, and she got nervous around Josie in a way that seemed less like judgment and more like fascination. "My grandma used to talk about that chapel," Amber said, ringing up a gallon of water with more attention than the task required. "Said there was a woman used to come around it, way back. Before my time, obviously. Grandma said she just stopped coming one day. Never said why. People used to ask your uncle about it, and he'd just go quiet." "A woman," Josie repeated. "That's all I know. Grandma gets kind of cagey about it, actually. Like it's not her business to say more." Amber slid the water across the counter. "You should ask Ruth Ann. She'd know. If she wanted to tell you. If she wanted to tell you." Josie noted the phrasing. Not if she knew. Everyone seemed certain Ruth Ann knew. The question was whether she'd say. Back at the chapel that night, Josie did something she hadn't let herself do yet. She really looked at the altar itself, not just the cabinet behind it. Up close, in the flashlight's beam, she noticed for the first time that the altar's wooden surface had a long, faint groove worn into it, waist-high, the kind of mark that comes from years of a hand resting in the exact same spot, over and over. For so long, it wears a shallow path into old oak. Someone had stood at that altar, in that exact position, more times than she could imagine. She didn't touch the cabinet's locks, not yet, but she let her palm rest, briefly, in that same worn groove, and felt something she didn't have a word for. Not grief exactly, since she hadn't known this man to grieve him properly. Something closer to recognition, the particular ache of standing somewhere someone else had stood, over and over, working through something alone. The next few days brought the beginnings of real progress. She patched the worst of the water damage in the back room. What had apparently served as Earl Prather's living quarters, little more than a cot, a wood stove, and a single shelf of paperback novels gone soft with damp. She cleared brush from around the foundation. She met, briefly and unhelpfully, the county extension agent, who informed her the 10 acres included a defunct well and roughly 2 acres of what he called decent bottomland, if you ever wanted to put something in it. A comment she filed away without much interest, focused as she was on keeping a roof over her head, rather than any grand plans for the land. It was Ruth Ann who came around again on the 6th day, this time without a casserole, just her sharp eyes and her sensible shoes, walking the property line like she was checking on something. "You've been busy," she said, taking in the patched roof, the cleared brush. "Trying to be." Josie hesitated, then decided the directness that had never done her any favors in foster homes might actually work on a woman like Ruth Ann. Amber at the gas station said there used to be a woman who came around here, a long time ago, said my uncle went quiet whenever anyone asked about her. Something crossed Ruth Ann's face. Not surprise exactly, more like the weary recognition of a question she'd known was coming eventually and had hoped might take longer. "Small towns," Ruth Ann said after a moment, "remember everything and understand almost none of it." She looked toward the chapel doors, toward the altar just visible through them, and her jaw tightened in a way Josie was starting to recognize as this woman's version of deciding something. "There was somebody, yes, long before you were born. Practically, it ended badly, whatever it was. I don't know the whole of it, and I won't pretend I do. Earl never told me the particulars, and I never pushed, because some men, when they go quiet about something, going quiet is the only way they know how to survive it. But it's connected, Josie said, to whatever's in that cabinet. Ruth Ann didn't answer that directly. She only said, he built the cabinet about a year after she stopped coming around. If the timing's what I think it is, make of that what you will. And then, because Ruth Ann Coulter was not a woman who lingered once she'd said her piece, she turned and walked back down the gravel spur, leaving Josie standing in the last of the daylight with more questions than she'd started the day with, a year after she stopped coming around. The math wasn't exact, but it was enough to make the tin box in Josie's duffel bag feel suddenly, uncomfortably significant. A photograph, a half-name, a locked cabinet built in grief, added to and relocked every few years, like a wound a man kept reopening and dressing again, rather than ever letting it heal. That night, lying in the third pew, Josie found herself doing something she hadn't done in longer than she could remember, wondering, actively, hungrily, about someone else's life instead of just surviving her own. Who was Core? What had happened between her and Earl Prather that a whole town remembered the shape of, but not the substance? And why, out of everyone in his life, had he left all of it, the chapel, the land, the sealed cabinet, and whatever grief was locked inside it, to a great niece he'd met exactly once, at a funeral, when she was 9 years old, and he was already, by every account, a man going quiet? She didn't have an answer. But for the first time since she'd arrived, with $38 and a duffel bag, she realized she wanted one. Not because it might mean money, though God knew she needed that too, but because some part of her recognized, in this locked-away, grief-worn stranger's chapel, the shape of her own life. People who loved and lost and learned to seal things away rather than risk losing them again. The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose boards she hadn't gotten to yet, and somewhere out past the tree line, an owl called once, low and long. Josie pulled the blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes, and the last thing she thought before sleep took her was the half-erased word on that strip of masking tape, and how badly, now, she needed to know what it said. The library 2 towns over yielded more than roofing instructions on Josie's second visit. She'd gone back for a book on well repair, but it was the librarian, an older woman named Pearl Sims, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and clearly ran the county's real information network from behind a returns desk, who gave her something far more useful than she'd asked for. "Prather," Pearl said, when Josie mentioned the name while filling out a library card application. "You're the one living out at his chapel." "Not a question, same as everyone else. We've got the old county paper on microfiche, you know. Back issues, going back 60-some years. If you're curious about your uncle, that's where I'd look." Man kept to himself, but a small-town paper writes about everybody eventually, whether they want it or not. It took Josie 2 hours, scrolling through grainy microfiche in a back room that smelled like dust and old glue, but she found it. A wedding announcement, 21 years old, black and white, and badly reproduced. Earl Prather, of the Prather farm, to wed Cora Jean Whitfield, of town. A photograph beneath it, faces small and unclear, but unmistakably the same 2 figures from the water-damaged tin box photo in her duffel bag. Whitfield. Josie sat back in the hard library chair, the pieces sliding together with a click she felt in her chest. Whitfield. The same name as Dale, the feed store owner who dropped off shingles without a word and driven off before she could thank him. She didn't sleep well that night, turning the name over and over. The next morning, she walked the 1.5 miles into town instead of driving, mostly to have time to think, and found herself standing in front of the feed store before she'd fully decided to go there. Dale was behind the counter, sorting nails into bins, and he looked up at her with the same wary, closed-off expression he'd worn the day he first found her sweeping out the chapel. Cora Jean Whitfield, Josie said, before she lost her nerve. Was she your sister? Dale set down the box of nails. His jaw worked once, twice, before he spoke again. You've been digging. I found a photograph. And a wedding announcement. Josie didn't apologize for it, though some old instinct told her to. I'm not trying to stir up anything that's not mine to stir. I just want to understand the man who left me his whole life. Dale was quiet long enough that Josie thought he might simply ask her to leave. Instead, he came around the counter, locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and gestured her toward a pair of folding chairs in the back of the store, next to a wood stove that wasn't lit. My sister married Earl Prather when she was 22 years old, he said, finally, once they were both seated. Happiest I ever saw her, those first years. Then they lost a baby, stillborn, 6 months along, and something in both of them just didn't come back the same after that. Cora wanted to leave the county. Start fresh somewhere the memory wasn't waiting around every corner. Earl couldn't do it. Wouldn't leave the farm, wouldn't leave the chapel where they'd married, wouldn't leave the little plot out back where they'd buried the baby without a name, because leaving felt to him like abandoning the only proof that child had ever existed at all. Josie felt something tighten in her own chest. An old, familiar ache she recognized from a different direction entirely. She left anyway, Dale went on. Not right away. It took years of arguing that never really turned into anything but two people going quieter and quieter around each other. But she left, eventually. Moved to Ohio, remarried, had 2 more kids who lived. I still talk to her most Christmases. He looked toward the window, toward the general direction of the chapel he couldn't actually see from here. Earl never remarried, never really left the property again. Not for more than a supply run into town. Just got quieter every year, like a man serving out a sentence he'd given himself. The cabinet, Josie said, behind the altar. Dale's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders did. Built it about a year after Cora left for good. I always figured it was where he kept whatever he couldn't stand to look at, and couldn't make himself throw away either. He shook his head slowly. I don't know what's in it, if that's what you're asking. Never asked him. Some things a man's entitled to keep to himself, even from family. Josie thought about the groove worn into the altar, waist high, the shape of a hand resting in the same place year after year. She thought about a man standing in an empty chapel, alone, for 11 years, with a locked cabinet at his back, holding whatever remained of the life he'd built and lost. Why leave it to me? She asked, finally, the question that had been sitting under everything else since the lawyer's letter first found her. He met me once, at my mother's funeral. I don't even remember it clearly. Dale considered this for a long moment. Your mother was his favorite niece, way back, he said. Used to write him letters when she was younger, before she passed, before you were even born probably. I remember him mentioning it, once or twice, real offhand, that she was the only one in the family who ever wrote back, after Cora left, and everybody else sort of drifted off. Maybe that's reason enough for a lonely old man. Maybe it's something else. I genuinely couldn't tell you. Your mother was his favorite niece. Josie held on to that, turning it over like a coin, feeling its weight. Her mother, dead 13 years now, remembered mostly in fragments of dish soap and a sideways laugh, had apparently kept a thread of connection to this quiet, grieving man that Josie herself had never known existed. She walked back to the chapel that afternoon with more questions answered than she'd had that morning, but somehow feeling less settled rather than more. A baby without a name, buried somewhere on the property she now owned. A wife who'd left because staying hurt too much. A man who'd chosen for 11 years to sit alone with his grief rather than let any of it go. And a cabinet, sealed 3 times over, that she was now more certain than ever held something to do with all of it. That evening, restless, she took her flashlight out past the chapel's back door, past the cleared brush and the wood stove chimney, toward the tree line the county extension agent had mentioned, the decent bottomland she'd dismissed without much thought. It took 20 minutes of walking through waist-high grass before she found it. A small, weathered wooden marker, no bigger than a shoebox lid, half swallowed by weeds, with no name carved into it at all. Just 2 dates, 11 months apart, and beneath them, worn nearly smooth by 2 decades of rain, a single carved word: beloved. Josie stood there a long time in the dark, flashlight beam trembling slightly in her hand, feeling the full weight of what she'd stumbled into. This wasn't just an abandoned building and a strange inheritance anymore. This was a man's entire unspoken grief, laid out across 10 acres and 1 locked cabinet. And somehow, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, he had trusted her, a great niece he'd met exactly once, to be the one who finally found it. She walked back to the chapel slower than she'd walked out, and that night, for the first time, she let herself stand in front of the altar with her hand actually resting against the cold metal of the first padlock. She didn't open it, not yet, but she stood there long enough to notice something she hadn't seen before, half hidden beneath a layer of grime on the underside of the middle lock. A small string, tied through the shackle, with something dangling from the end of it that caught the flashlight beam and threw back a dull, unmistakable glint of brass. A key, tied there, in plain sight, all along, for whoever finally cared enough to look closely. The key on the string didn't fit the padlock it hung from. Josie discovered that the next morning, in daylight, after a night of barely sleeping for thinking about it. She'd untied the string with careful fingers, half expecting it to crumble to dust after 11 years, but it held, and the small brass key came free into her palm. Old-fashioned, the kind with a round bow and a long, thin shaft, nothing like the modern padlocks bolted to the cabinet at all. She tried it in the first lock, nothing. The second, nothing. By the third, she wasn't surprised when it didn't turn either, but she noticed something she'd missed before. A fourth mechanism, smaller and older than the other 3, half hidden behind the cabinet's bottom hinge, easy to miss unless you were running your fingers along every inch of the wood the way she now was. A simple keyhole, unadorned, clearly original to whenever Earl Prather had first built the thing. The key slid in clean and turned with a soft, satisfying click. But the 3 padlocks still hung heavy and rusted above it, and Josie realized, with a mix of frustration and something almost like respect for the dead man's stubbornness, that the old key only unlocked an inner mechanism, a failsafe maybe, or a message in itself. You can get this far, the rest you'll have to earn. She spent the better part of that day at the hardware store in town, a 40-minute drive, since Dale's feed store didn't carry bolt cutters heavy-duty enough for the job, and came back with a pair that cost more than she wanted to admit, money she genuinely couldn't spare, paid for with the last of her $38, plus what she'd made doing odd cleaning work for Pearl Sims at the library that week. The first padlock took nearly 20 minutes of straining before the shackle finally gave, snapping with a sound that echoed through the empty nave like a gunshot. The second came easier, the metal weaker, more given over to rust. The third, the newest looking of the 3, the one Josie guessed had been added last, maybe in Earl Prather's final years, resisted longest of all, like even inanimate metal understood there was something worth protecting. When it finally broke, the cabinet door swung open on hinges that hadn't moved in over a decade, releasing a smell of cedar and old paper and something else underneath it, faint and sweet, like beeswax candles long since gone out. Josie stood there for a long moment before she let herself look inside. The top shelf held cash, not a fortune by movie standards, but more money than Josie had ever seen in one place in her life, bundled in rubber bands gone brittle with age, stacks of 20s and 50s that had clearly been saved and added to over years, rather than deposited all at once. She counted it later, hands shaking, and found just over $11,000, more money than she'd earned in the past 2 years combined. But it wasn't the money that made her sit down hard on the altar steps, breath gone shallow. Beneath the cash, wrapped in a square of faded blue flannel, sat a small collection of objects that told a story more clearly than any bank statement could. A woman's wedding ring, thin gold, the kind a young farm couple could have afforded 20 years ago. A single baby shoe, white, never worn, the leather still soft. A stack of letters tied with the same kind of string that had held the key, addressed in a woman's careful handwriting to Earl. Cora's letters, Josie understood immediately, kept even after she'd left for good. And at the very bottom, in an envelope yellowed with age, a letter addressed not to Earl at all, but to whoever finds this. Josie's hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting matched the masking tape on the cabinet door, matched the date on the back of the tin box photograph. Earl Prather's own hand, careful and old-fashioned, clearly written slowly, over what might have been more than one sitting. If you're reading this, I expect I've passed on, and whatever family I have left has decided this chapel and this land are worth more trouble than they're worth to keep for themselves. Which tells me you must be someone who needed it more than they did, or someone stubborn enough to want it anyway. Either way, I hope you'll forgive an old man his strange way of leaving things. The money isn't the gift. I want to say that plainly, in case whoever reads this only sees the dollar signs and stops there. $11,000 will help you get a start, and I'm glad of that. But it was never the point of any of this. The point was the land and the chance. I bought this 10 acres with my own 2 hands, board by board, season by season, back when I still believed a person could build something that would outlast their own grief. I was wrong about a great many things in my life. I don't believe I was wrong about that. I lost the 2 people I loved most in this world within 11 months of each other. One who never drew a breath, and one who simply couldn't stay in a place that reminded her of the one who didn't. I understand now, though it took me the better part of 2 decades to understand it, that a man can honor his grief without letting it become the only room he lives in. I didn't manage that. I hope whoever you are, you'll manage it better than I did. Whatever you build here, and I hope you build something, build it because you decided to keep going, not because you're trying to prove anything to anyone who doubted you. That's the only foundation worth standing on. Everything else is just money, and money by itself never kept anybody warm on a cold night. Take care of the little grave out past the tree line, if you're willing. Nobody's name is on it, but somebody ought to remember it's there. Earl Josie read the letter 3 times before she trusted herself to fold it back up. Outside, the afternoon light had gone long and gold through the newly unboarded windows, catching the dust in the air, catching the worn groove in the altar where a grieving man had stood for 11 years, and she understood, really understood, in a way that settled somewhere deep in her chest, that she hadn't just inherited a building and a strange dead man's savings. She'd inherited a chance to finish something he never could. She thought about her own mother, and the letters she'd apparently written to this quiet great-uncle that nobody else in the family had bothered with. She thought about the little wooden marker in the tall grass with no name on it, just 2 dates and a single word. She thought about Cora Jean Whitfield, gone to Ohio with a new family and new children who lived, and wondered if she ever thought about this chapel at all, or if she'd managed, somehow, to build the kind of forward-facing life Earl Prather never let himself have. That night, Josie didn't sleep in the pew. She carried the moving blanket out past the tree line instead, to the small grave with no name, and sat beside it until the stars came out fully overhead, cold and sharp and endless. She didn't cry exactly. She'd never been much of a crier, not since she was very young, but she sat with something heavy and important settling into place inside her, a sense that whatever came next, she owed it to a dead man she'd barely known to do this right. $11,000 would fix the roof properly, replace the well, maybe even get the old wood stove working again before winter set in. It was more security than she'd had in years. But as she sat there in the dark, it was the letter's words that stayed with her loudest. Build it because you decided to keep going. She had $38 when she arrived. She had considerably more than that now. But for the first time since the lawyer's letter had found her, Josie Calloway understood that the real inheritance had never been the money at all. And she still had no idea how much more of Earl Prather's story remained buried, unspoken, somewhere on the 10 acres she now called hers. The $11,000 didn't last as long as Josie hoped it would. She'd budgeted carefully, or thought she had, $2,000 for a proper well repair, $3,000 held back for the roof, the rest set aside for the wood stove, insulation, and the dozen small emergencies she assumed would come up along the way. What she hadn't budgeted for was the county inspector. He arrived on a Tuesday, unannounced, a clipboard-carrying man named Reyes, who informed her, with the flat courtesy of someone who'd delivered bad news 1,000 times before, that the chapel's electrical wiring, decades old, cloth-insulated, exactly the kind of thing that had been unfit for occupancy language on the county's books in the first place, would need to be fully replaced before the structure could be legally reclassified as a residence. Otherwise, he said, not unkindly, she was living in a fire hazard, and the county could, technically, force her out. How much is fully replaced? Josie asked, already dreading the answer. It was $4,000, minimum, for a building the size of the chapel. Reyes gave her the name of an electrician 2 counties over who did fair work at fair prices, and left her standing on the porch doing math that didn't come out anywhere close to comfortable. She did it anyway. She had to. She hired the electrician, watched her carefully built cushion shrink to almost nothing, and told herself it was an investment, the same way the roof and the well had been investments, necessary costs of turning a liability into a home. Then the storm came. It arrived on a Thursday night in late September, a line of severe weather the local radio station had been warning about all week. Though Josie hadn't taken it as seriously as she should have. She'd patched the roof herself after all, taught herself out of a library book, and it had held fine through 2 smaller rains already. She wasn't prepared for the wind that came through around midnight, screaming through the pines, or the sound, sudden, sharp, terrible, of the bell tower finally giving up its 2-degree lean entirely. It came down sometime after 1 a.m., crashing through the corner of the roof she'd patched with the most confidence, tearing a hole nearly 6 feet wide, letting the storm pour directly into the nave, where, 3 hours earlier, Josie had been sleeping in the very pew now soaked through and covered in splintered wood and shingle debris. She'd moved, at the last minute, to check on a leak near the back room, which was the only reason she wasn't lying under the wreckage when it fell. By morning, the storm had passed, and Josie stood in the wreckage of what she'd worked 3 weeks to rebuild, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel since she was much younger, not just discouragement, but something closer to despair. Water had ruined the hymnals she'd carefully stacked and dried out. The pew where she usually slept was crushed nearly flat under a support beam from the bell tower, and the money she had left, barely $600 after the electrician's deposit, wasn't close to enough to fix a hole this size before winter set in. She sat on the porch steps in the gray morning light, soaked through, exhausted, and let herself cry for the first time since arriving. Not delicate tears, but the full, ugly kind she'd been holding back for years, for this chapel, and for every place before it that had never quite managed to hold together long enough to feel safe. She didn't hear Dale's truck pull up until he was already out of it. Heard the tower came down, he said, standing at the edge of the wreckage, taking in the hole in the roof, the ruined pew, Josie's soaked and reddened eyes. He didn't say anything comforting. that wasn't his way. He just looked at the damage for a long moment, then said, "I've got a cousin does roofing work. Does it well, does it fast. And I know a fella at the lumber yard who owes me a favor big enough to cover half what you'd need in materials." "I can't pay for a repair like this," Josie said, too tired to pretend otherwise. "Not right now. Maybe not for months." "Didn't ask you to pay for it," Dale said, gruffer than usual, like the offer embarrassed him. "Ruth Ann's already calling around. Amber's granddad's got a spare generator if you need power while the electrical work's still going. This is a small town, girl. We don't let a roof fall in on somebody and just watch." It wasn't charity exactly, or it was, but it didn't feel the way charity usually felt to Josie, like something handed down from above with an implicit debt attached. It felt like something closer to what Ruth Ann's casserole had been, and the shingles Dale had left without comment, and the fair price the electrician had quoted without her having to ask twice. It felt, she realized with something like surprise, like being part of a place instead of just surviving in one. Over the next 4 days, half the county seemed to pass through the chapel's front doors. Dale's cousin and 2 of his crew tore out the damaged section of roof and framed a new one, faster and sturdier than Josie's library book repair had ever been. Ruth Ann organized what she called a little something that turned out to be enough donated food to feed the work crew for a week straight. Pearl Sims sent her nephew over with a truckload of scrap lumber from a barn he'd recently torn down. Even Amber showed up on her day off, sweeping debris with a determination that suggested she'd been waiting for an excuse to be more than just the girl behind the register. Josie worked alongside all of them, hauling debris, holding boards steady, learning more about basic construction in 4 days than she had in the 3 weeks before the storm combined. Her hands blistered and calloused in new places, her back ached every night, and somewhere in the middle of all that exhausting, unglamorous labor, she felt something shift inside her that she didn't have words for yet. The particular, unfamiliar sensation of being helped by people who expected nothing back. On the 4th evening, the new roof framed and half-shingled, Dale found her sitting on the porch steps again, this time dry and considerably less devastated than she'd been 4 days earlier. "You didn't have to do all this," Josie said. Dale shrugged, looking up at the half-finished roofline with something like satisfaction. "Earl was family, whatever else he was. And you're finishing something he started and never could." He was quiet a moment, then added, gruffer still, like it cost him something to say it out loud. "My sister left this place because staying here felt like drowning. Watching you fight to keep it standing instead, that means something to people around here, whether they say so or not." Josie thought about the $11,000, now down to almost nothing. She thought about the letter in the cabinet, about building something because she'd decided to keep going, not to prove anything to anyone. She thought about the little grave with no name, still waiting for her to properly tend to it once the more urgent repairs were finished. The storm had taken almost everything she'd rebuilt, but it had also, in the taking, shown her something Earl Prather's 11 years of solitude never had a chance to learn. That a foundation wasn't just boards and shingles and careful budgeting. Sometimes it was simply people, showing up, again and again, until you stopped flinching every time you heard a truck coming up the gravel spur. She didn't know yet how she'd finish paying for the electrical work, or where the money for the rest of the roof would come from. But for the first time since she'd arrived with $38 and a duffel bag, Josie Calloway didn't feel entirely alone in figuring it out. The roof got finished, in the end, but the electrical work stalled out entirely once the storm's cleanup costs ate through what little cushion remained. Josie found herself, 2 weeks after the bell tower came down, back to counting dollars the way she had before the cabinet ever opened. Except now, she had a half-repaired chapel instead of a car, which was progress, technically, but didn't feel like much when the county's 30-day deadline for the electrical inspection kept ticking closer. She took work where she could find it. Cleaning for Pearl Sims at the library twice a week, stacking feed bags for Dale on Saturdays, which he paid her for in cash, and refused to discuss further, waving off her thanks with the same gruffness he brought to everything. A few odd jobs Ruth Ann arranged around town, clearing a widow's gutters, helping an elderly couple sort through a garage nobody had touched in years. It wasn't much, but it was steady, and steady was something Josie had learned, the hard way, to value over almost everything else. It was during one of those garage sorting jobs, 3 weeks after the storm, that the first real crack in her fragile stability appeared. She was helping shift a heavy wooden dresser when it caught wrong on the door frame, and instead of letting it drop safely, her instinct was to catch it, a decision that put her hand between 200 pounds of old oak and a metal door frame for exactly the wrong half-second. The pain was immediate and enormous. 2 fingers on her right hand, swollen purple within the hour, turned out on the drive to the emergency clinic 2 towns over to be broken in 3 places. The clinic bill alone ran to just over $400, money she genuinely did not have. The cast came with a warning: 6 weeks minimum before she could use that hand for any real work, longer before it would be back to full strength. 6 weeks in which she couldn't finish the electrical wiring herself, couldn't do the odd jobs that were barely keeping her afloat, couldn't even properly grip a hammer if the county inspector came back demanding progress she had no way of making. She sat in the chapel that night, hand throbbing under the cast, feeling something colder and more dangerous than exhaustion settle into her chest. The old, familiar certainty that this, like everything else in her life, was about to fall apart, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She thought about the group home that had felt like family for 3 years before a paperwork error moved her away. She thought about the studio apartment she'd lost the second her hours got cut. Everything good in her life had always come with an expiration date she couldn't see coming until it arrived, and here it was again, right on schedule, dressed up as a broken hand. Build it because you decided to keep going, not because you're trying to prove anything to anyone. Earl's words from the letter surfaced in her mind unbidden, and for the first time since she'd read them, they felt less like comfort and more like an accusation. She didn't know how to keep going with a broken hand and $400 in fresh debt, and 30 days left on a county deadline she had no way of meeting. She didn't tell anyone at first, some old instinct, the same one that had kept her sleeping in parking lots rather than asking her cousin for help, the same one that made her flinch every time someone offered kindness without an obvious motive attached, told her to handle this quietly, the way she'd handled everything else, alone. It was Amber who found out first, purely by accident, when Josie came into the gas station one-handed and awkward, trying to work her wallet out of her bag with fingers that no longer cooperated. Amber didn't make a scene about it. She just quietly rang up the water, said nothing about the cast, beyond a soft, "Ouch, that looks rough," and let Josie leave with her dignity intact. But word travels in a small town whether you want it to or not, and by the following afternoon, Ruth Ann was standing on the chapel's porch steps with a look Josie was starting to recognize as this woman's particular brand of no-nonsense concern. "Dale tells me you've been avoiding the feed store," Ruth Ann said, by way of greeting. "Can't lift feed bags with a broken hand." Josie held it up, the purple visible even past the cast's edge. "Figured I'd just wait it out." "Wait it out how, exactly? You've got a county deadline and no income for 6 weeks. Ruth Ann's tone wasn't unkind, but it wasn't soft either. "You've been letting this whole town help you when it came to hammers and shingles. Why's this any different?" Josie didn't have a good answer for that, not one she was willing to say out loud. The truth was uglier and more familiar than she wanted to admit. Physical labor, board by board, Felt like something she'd earned the right to accept help with. But this, needing actual money, needing someone else to simply give her something with no clear way to pay it back, felt too much like every time in her life someone's kindness had turned out to have strings she hadn't noticed until they pulled tight. Ruth Ann seemed to read some version of this on her face, because her expression softened, just slightly. Earl was the same way, you know, proud past the point of sense. Wouldn't take help even when it would have cost him nothing to accept it. Spent 11 years alone out here, partly because he couldn't stomach the idea of needing anybody. She sat down on the porch step next to Josie, uninvited, the way she did most things. That pride didn't serve him well. I'd hate to watch it not serve you well either. I don't know how to just take things from people, Josie said, quieter than she meant to. Every time I have, it's ended up costing me more than I expected. Maybe, Ruth Ann said, or maybe you've just never had the right people offering. She stood, brushing off her skirt. The electrician already knows about your hand, Dale told him. He says he can finish the wiring himself, in exchange for you handling his invoicing and scheduling once that hand heals up. Man hates paperwork worse than he hates driving out this far. That's not charity, girl. That's a trade. You'd be a fool to turn it down out of pride. Josie sat with that for a long moment after Ruth Ann left, turning the offer over, feeling the old instinct to refuse warring against something newer and more fragile. The same thing that had let her accept the storm cleanup, the shingles, the casserole. Maybe Ruth Ann was right. Maybe the difference between charity and community was smaller than she'd always assumed, and maybe the real risk wasn't in accepting help. Maybe it was in refusing it so long that she ended up as alone and grief-locked as the man whose chapel she now called home. She called the electrician the next morning and accepted the trade. It didn't fix her hand any faster, and it didn't erase the county deadline creeping closer. But it was, she recognized slowly, the first time in years she'd let herself need something from someone else, without immediately building a wall around the feeling. Her hand healed slower than the doctor promised, but by the 5th week, Josie could grip a pen well enough to start on the electrician's invoicing, sitting at the small desk she'd set up in what used to be Earl Prather's back room. It was tedious work, unglamorous, but it kept her afloat. And more than that, it kept her hands busy on the long evenings when the chapel felt too quiet and her mind kept drifting back to the tied bundle of letters still sitting untouched in the cabinet. She'd read Earl's letter to whoever finds this a dozen times by now. She hadn't touched Cora's letters at all. Some instinct told her they were a different kind of private, not meant for a stranger's eyes, even one who'd inherited the right to open the cabinet that held them. But one night in late October, cast finally off, hand stiff but functional, curiosity finally won out over hesitation. The letters were in order, dated, spanning almost 3 years. The early ones were warm, ordinary. A young wife writing to a husband working a distant harvest, small complaints about weather and neighbors, affection folded into every line. Then came a gap of several months. Then a letter dated 11 months after the wedding announcement Josie had found on microfiche, the handwriting shakier than before. Earl, I know you don't want to talk about it anymore, and I understand why, I do. But I can't keep living in the room we painted for her. I need to leave the county, just for a while, just long enough to breathe. I'm not asking you to come with me if you're not ready. I'm asking you not to make me choose between grieving in a different place and staying married to you. I don't think those things should have to be the same choice, but you've made them the same choice, and I don't know how much longer I can live inside that. The letters after that grew shorter, more distant, the affection curdling slowly into something sadder and more resigned, until the final one, dated almost 2 years after the wedding, simply read, I'm not coming back, Earl. I've tried to explain why more times than I can count. I hope someday you let yourself out of that chapel. I mean that kindly. See, Josie sat with that letter for a long time, feeling the particular grief of reading someone else's ending. But it was the very last item in the bundle. Not a letter from Cora at all, but a smaller, separate envelope tucked behind the others. Addressed in handwriting Josie recognized instantly, achingly, from a handful of old birthday cards she'd kept her whole life, that made her breath catch entirely. Her mother's handwriting. Uncle Earl, I know we don't talk much, and I know you like it that way, but I think about you more than you'd probably guess. Denise is older, more sensible for her age. I love her, but if anything ever happened to me, I know that's a strange thing to write in a letter, forgive me. I've just been thinking about it lately. I'd want my daughter to end up somewhere with people who understand what it means to keep going after losing everything. You've done that, in your own quiet way, longer than almost anyone I know. I don't know if you'll ever meet her properly, but if you do, I hope you'll be gentle with her. She's got my stubbornness and, I suspect, yours too, whether either of us likes it. Marianne. The letter was dated 4 months before Josie's mother died. Josie read it 3 times, hands trembling, the pieces of the last 2 months rearranging themselves entirely in her mind. This wasn't simply a distant relative's strange, sentimental choice to leave everything to a great niece he'd met once at a funeral. Her mother had written to Earl, had thought of him, had trusted him, had asked him, in her own oblique way, to be gentle with her daughter if the worst ever happened, years before it actually did. Which meant Earl Prather had known for 13 years that a young girl out there in the world might one day need somewhere to land. And when the time came, when the courthouse letter finally found its way to a woman folding towels for $4 an hour in Chattanooga, it hadn't been a stranger's whim at all. It had been a promise, kept quietly, patiently, for over a decade, by a man who'd spent that same decade unable to keep any other promise he'd made to anyone alive. She thought about Dale's words. Your mother was his favorite niece, way back, the only one who wrote back. She thought about the funeral she barely remembered, the tall, quiet man standing at the back of the room. He hadn't been a distant stranger even then. He'd been a man honoring a request from a niece he'd loved, watching a 9-year-old girl he already knew he might, someday, be responsible for. The realization didn't fix her broken hand, or her strained finances, or the county deadline still looming. But it changed something fundamental in how she understood the 10 acres around her. This wasn't a stranger's chapel she'd stumbled into, by luck, and $9 in back taxes. It was the last act of a promise her own mother had set in motion before Josie was even old enough to understand what a promise was. She carried both letters, her mother's and Cora's final note, out to the small grave past the tree line that night, sitting beside the nameless marker under a sky gone clear and cold, with the first real hint of winter. I didn't know any of this, she said out loud, to no one. To everyone. I didn't know you were watching out for me before I even knew you existed. The wind moved through the pines, and somewhere distant, an owl called the way it had, that first week, low and long. Josie sat with the letters until her hands went numb from the cold, and when she finally walked back to the chapel, she carried with her not just grief for a man she'd barely known, but something new and unfamiliar and steadying, the sense that she had been loved, in some quiet and roundabout way, by people who'd never gotten the chance to say so directly. She didn't yet know what she'd do with that knowledge, but she knew, lying in the pew that night with the letters tucked safely beside her, that whatever came next, the county deadline, the electrical work, the long winter ahead, she wasn't facing any of it as alone as she'd believed just 24 hours earlier. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a smaller question had already begun to form, one she hadn't let herself ask yet. If her mother had trusted Earl enough to write that letter, had there been others? Had Earl kept anything else, tucked away somewhere on this property, that might tell her more about the mother she'd lost too young to really know? The electrician finished the wiring on the second Tuesday of November, 3 days before the county's original deadline, and Josie spent that whole week almost too afraid to feel relieved. She'd learned, by now, not to trust good news until it had fully arrived. Inspector Reyes came back on schedule, clipboard in hand, and walked the chapel slower than he had the first time, testing outlets, checking the panel box, running his flashlight along seams Josie hadn't even known to worry about. When he finally straightened up and told her the wiring passed, that the chapel could be formally reclassified as a legal residence, Josie had to sit down on the porch steps for a full minute before she trusted her legs again. She thought that was the hard part. She was wrong. The cold snap came 2 nights later, temperatures dropping harder and faster than the forecast had predicted, and Josie, new wiring or not, made the same mistake half the county made every winter. She ran the space heater in the back room, too close to a stack of dry kindling she'd meant to move days earlier and never had. She woke sometime after 2 a.m., not to flames, but to the smell of something scorching, sharp and acrid, cutting through her sleep like a blade. She was up and moving before she was fully awake, some old instinct from years of sleeping lightly, in places that were never quite safe, kicking in before conscious thought caught up. The kindling stack had caught, a small but growing fire licking up the side of the wood stove's brick surround, smoke already thickening near the ceiling. 6 months earlier, Josie might have panicked, might have made it worse trying to smother it with the wrong thing, or wasting precious seconds hunting for a phone. Instead, she reached for the bucket of sand she'd started keeping by the back door, a habit she'd picked up from Dale's crew during the roof repair, one of those small pieces of practical wisdom she'd absorbed without realizing how much she'd absorbed, and dumped it directly onto the flames before they could reach the kindling stack fully. It went out fast, smothered rather than fed, leaving a scorched patch on the brick and a room full of smoke, but no real damage beyond a ruined stack of firewood, and a badly frightened 20-year-old standing in her nightclothes at 2 a.m., heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her broken then healed hand. She sat on the backroom floor afterward, coughing smoke out of her lungs, and let herself shake for a long while before she trusted herself to stand. It wasn't the near disaster itself that stayed with her in the days after, so much as the moment right after, the instinct that had kicked in without her having to think, the bucket of sand she hadn't even remembered placing there until it saved her. Somewhere in the last 4 months, without really noticing it happening, she'd become someone who thought ahead, who prepared for the version of trouble that hadn't arrived yet. Earl's Chapel had taught her that, board by board, mistake by mistake, the same way it had taught Earl himself, once, before grief had closed him off from using any of it towards something forward-facing. She told Dale about the fire the next morning, mostly because she suspected Amber or Ruth Ann would hear about it second-hand within the day regardless, and she'd rather he heard it plainly from her. "Sand bucket," Dale repeated, when she explained it, something that might have been approval flickering across his usually unreadable face. "That's smarter than half the fools I've known burn a shed down out here. Earl kept one too, you know. Same spot, more or less, back when he still used that stove regular." Josie hadn't known that. She sat with it a moment, the idea that she'd unconsciously placed her own safeguard in nearly the same spot a grieving man had placed his, decades earlier, both of them slowly teaching themselves to survive the same unpredictable land. That evening, sitting at the small desk in the back room, the scorch mark still visible on the brick beside her, Josie finally let herself write the letter she'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. A short note to Cora Jean Whitfield, care of Dale, asking nothing, expecting nothing, simply letting her know that the chapel was standing again, that the little grave past the tree line was finally being properly tended, and that whatever had happened between her and Earl all those years ago, She hoped Cora had found the kind of forward-facing life Earl never let himself have. She didn't expect a reply. She mailed it anyway, because some things, she was learning, were worth doing even without the certainty of an answer. The following week brought the last of the season's paperwork, the county's formal reclassification letter, arriving in an envelope so ordinary-looking it took Josie a moment to recognize what it meant. The chapel, officially, legally, was hers to live in, hers to call home. No longer a liability sitting on the county's books, waiting to be condemned. She read the letter twice, then walked out past the tree line to the small grave, sitting beside it, the way she had that first cold night, with her mother's letter trembling in her hands. Winter light slanted long and gold through the pines, and the 10 acres around her, repaired roof, rewired chapel, cleared brush, a sand bucket by the back door, no longer felt like a stranger's forgotten burden. It felt, for the first time since she'd arrived with $38 and a duffel bag, entirely, unmistakably like home. "I kept it standing," she said quietly, to the nameless marker, to Earl, to her mother, to all of it. "I don't know if that's enough, but I kept it standing." She thought about the letter in the cabinet. Build it because you decided to keep going, and understood, finally, fully, that she had done exactly that. Not because a dead man's money had made it easy, not because the town's help had made it painless, but because somewhere across 4 hard months, board by board, mistake by mistake, she had decided, over and over, not to let this place, or herself, fall apart the way it so easily could have. Winter was coming. The chapel would hold. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Josie Calloway believed, without reservation, that she would hold too. She had nowhere to sleep at 20, so she broke into a sealed church, chapter 10, and 1,100 words. Spring came back to the chapel, the way it comes back everywhere eventually. Quietly, and then all at once. The kudzu Josie had spent a full weekend clearing from the north wall, showing the faintest green return at its roots. The pines shaking off the last of winter's frost. The bell tower, rebuilt sturdier than the original had ever been, casting a straight and steady shadow across the churchyard for the first time in longer than anyone in town could remember. A year had passed since Josie Calloway arrived with $38 and a duffel bag. She still slept in the back room most nights, though she'd built herself a proper bed frame out of lumber Dale's cousin had helped her mill, and the moving blanket had long since been retired to a cedar chest at the foot of it. The nave itself she'd left mostly as it was, pews polished but unchanged, the altar's worn groove sanded gently, never erased, a small brass plaque she'd had made, resting beside it with 3 words on it: beloved, remembered, home. She'd used what remained of Earl's money, along with what she'd earned trading her own labor and paperwork skills across half the county that year, to do something she hadn't planned when she first arrived. She'd opened the chapel's doors, one Saturday a month, to anyone in the county who needed a place to land for a while. Not a shelter, exactly. She didn't have the resources or the certifications for that, but a kitchen table, a hot meal, a spare room for a night or two when someone needed it, the way Ruth Ann's casserole and Dale's shingles had shown up for her without asking anything in return. Word had gotten around, the way it does, and more than a few young people passing through hard stretches of their own had found their way up the gravel spur. One of them was a girl named Talia, 17, aged out of a group home 2 counties over, who'd shown up in October with a backpack and a look Josie recognized instantly because she'd worn it herself not so long ago. Josie hadn't lectured her, hadn't pushed. She'd just made up the spare room, shown her where the tools were kept if she wanted to help with the spring planting, and let her find her own way toward trusting the place, the same slow way Josie had. "How'd you even end up out here?" Talia asked her one evening, sitting on the porch steps as the sun went down gold over the pines. Actually, everybody in town's got a different version of the story. Josie smiled, thinking of Earl's letter, still kept safe in the cabinet, read now closer to 100 times than a dozen. Somebody I barely knew decided, a long time before I ever needed it, that I was worth trusting with something. I spent about 4 months finding out what that actually meant. She'd gotten a letter back from Cora Jean Whitfield that spring, brief, careful, but warmer than she'd expected. Cora didn't come to visit, not yet, maybe not ever, and Josie had made her peace with that. But the letter had thanked her, plainly, for tending the little grave, for giving Earl's memory a kind of gentleness he'd never quite managed to give himself while he was alive. It was enough. Some things didn't need a full resolution to still be a kind of healing. Dale had become, without either of them ever naming it directly, something close to family. A standing Sunday dinner invitation, an open door at the feed store, a gruff kind of watchfulness that Josie had stopped mistaking for anything but love. Ruth Ann still showed up unannounced with casseroles, still gave advice nobody asked for, still occasionally reminded Josie, in her particular blunt way, that pride was a heavier thing to carry than most people realized until they'd set it down. Amber had started community college that fall. Tuition helped along in part by a small scholarship Josie had quietly set up, using some of the last of Earl's money. Not enough to cover everything, but enough to matter, enough to be the kind of foundation Earl's letter had talked about. It felt right, using it that way. It felt like exactly what an old man circling his own grief for 11 years might have wanted his money to eventually become, once someone finally cared enough to open the cabinet and ask what it was really for. Josie thought, often, about the version of herself who'd stood in that doorway a year ago, smelling wet pine and old dust, certain this crumbling building was simply the last stop before she ran out of options entirely. She hadn't known then that she was walking into the last act of a promise her own mother had set in motion years before her death. She hadn't known that a locked cabinet, 3 padlocks deep, held not just money, but the entire shape of a man's grief, and, buried beneath it, permission to grieve without losing herself the way he had. She knew it now, and more than that, she'd built something with it. Not just a repaired chapel, or a functioning well, or a rewired electrical panel, but a place where people who'd hit rock bottom, the way she once had, could find a door that opened instead of one that stayed locked. If you've ever felt like the worst chapter of your life might actually be the beginning of something you couldn't yet see, I hope this story reminded you that foundations get built slowly, board by board, by people willing to keep showing up, even when it would be easier not to. If Josie and Earl's story meant something to you tonight, stay a while longer if you can, and let me know in the comments what part of this one stayed with you. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. There's always another story waiting, another locked door somewhere, with something worth finding behind it.